It is my pleasure and honor to introduce you once again to Rabbi David Zaslow. He has a remarkable journey, some of which I wasn't aware of. He began as a poet and educator, uh, got his degree in creative writing and education in the 70s, and he worked as a full-time poet in the schools with a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, wrote and edited books on poetry during that period, and recorded 2 albums of children's poetry set to music. He was also awarded an American Book Award in 1988 for educational materials in an album called Shakin Loose with Mother Goose, featuring Steve Allen, Jayne Meadows. But with all the wonders of family, poetry, and music, he felt he wanted something deeper, a more personal connection with the God in his life. So he studied to become a rabbi and was ordained in 1995. Since then, he has been the spiritual leader of Havurah Shir Hadash Synagogue in Ashland, Oregon. Recently retired last summer, and he has authored a couple of books which are still available, several books, from him or through Amazon, including Jesus First Century Rabbi, which is awarded the Church Synagogue Library Association Award. Rabbi, will you fill us in on what you are currently doing in addition to speaking with us occasionally on Sundays?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. And to the whole group, it's just an honor to be here once again. When I hear your mission statement every time, it's so much is my mission statement too. It really reflects that. There's so much negativity that fundamentalist religions of all kinds, every religion, creates, and that when you get something like what you're doing here, it's not just new thought; it's deep thought. So, what I'm doing, Susan, is going around to different synagogues, either on Zoom or in person, leading weekend workshops, teaching classes on Zoom, things like that. If it's not on my website yet, but if people are interested, if they just email me at shalomrav, SHALOMRAV, I'll put it in the chat at AOL.com.
Thank
I'd
you.
be glad to let you know when I finally get my schedule up online. So, but
Lovely.
I'm doing a lot of Zoom classes that people are invited to come to. So,
Well, thank you for that update. Today, Rabbi's talk is going to be Reimagining Exodus. And with that, take it away.
thank you so much. It's great what Dennis said in the prayer about leaping for joy, because the word Passover in Hebrew, actually, Pesach, means leaping, and it's the season of our joy. So it's leaping for joy is a perfect term for that. So let me see if I can do my screen share here, and okay, there it is. Yeah, I'll start. I'll share. So these are the 2 books that if you're interested in, you could just email me. There's my email at the bottom. Reimagining Exodus is actually out of print now, but the publisher, it's a Christian publisher actually, Paraclete Press, still has the audio the digital version available. But I've got some copies that I bought, and then that I'll be glad to sell and ship to you. So if you're interested in any of them, just email me, and I will make sure you get them. So today's talk is called Reimagining Exodus, leaping into Passover, because the word Pesach, as I said in Hebrew, means to leap. It's a leaping holiday. It's a springtime holiday. Oh, by the way, start with a little humor. I know it's not for new thought, but I kind of get a kick out of that. All right, so happy Passover, and to our atheist friends, good luck. All right. Okay, one more bit of humor. Again, happy Easter. He is risen. And of course, we eat flatbread. We didn't eat anything risen. So that's what Passover is all about, is finding humility in eating bread that it's not all puffed up, which represents, of course, our egos. Judaism and later Christianity and Islam were born in unique cultures, whose wisdom and rituals were carried forward into their new monotheistic faiths. The word Easter might derive from the Middle Eastern fertility goddess Ishtar, whose temple foods like eggs were brought as offerings, hence the Ishtar egg. Or its roots might be in the West Germanic and Anglo-Saxon fertility goddess named Eostre. In Judaism, the name Queen Esther also derives from Ishtar, and her uncle Mordechai, his name derives from the god Marduk. Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, originally is an ancient pre-Judaic pagan lambing festival. In learning the origins of Passover and Easter, we see the roots go back much further than most of us realize. Now, on a personal level, each of us has a sacred story, a sacred wound, a story of enslavement, a story of martyrdom, of suffering that needs to be told, both for ourselves, the tellers, and to those who will hear us. Not to indulge ourselves, but to inspire, to bring hope. Even the story of Moses, who does not enter the promised land, gives me the hope that at the end of my life, though everything I had hoped for may not be done, I can leave in peace, that what I was meant to do was done. On the surface, Jesus and Moses both failed in their missions. Moses is told he cannot enter the promised land, and Jesus is crucified. Yet it is the stories of their failures and the redemption of those failures upon which the two great faith traditions are built. Making their stories real in our lives is the fulfillment of their lives. This is what reimagining is all about. And as I was saying before, the whole idea of resurrection, for example, though many of us do not believe in it literally, when you go out in the springtime, at least in temperate climates, and you see what's going on in nature, you could see how resurrection becomes the theme in Christianity of the Christian story of Jesus' crucifixion, and today's the anniversary, so to speak, of the resurrection in Christianity. In Judaism, the Passover is a story of liberation. So you see the idea of liberation and resurrection on a metaphorical level, they really overlap. Okay, so what is reimagining? Well, first of all, the Hebrew gets lost in translation. For example, the word Exodus doesn't mean, in Hebrew, it really has to do with going out. Every time we leave our homes, we're making an exodus. Every time we move into some special aspect of our lives, an age in our lives, or maybe a career change, we're making an exodus. It's almost like a natural aspect of life. There are a lot of overlooked facts that we don't remember when we're reading the Bible two-dimensionally. For example, Moses and Ramses, they were really raised as brothers. And so the whole beginning of the Exodus story is a continuation of the Genesis brother stories. Grammatical interpretation between biblical and modern Hebrew. This is pretty cool. The Exodus, when you're reading it in Hebrew, and the creation story don't end. I'll give you one example. The idea of the creation story, like in King James, it's translated, "In the beginning God created." Where in Hebrew, the word created gives a sense of past tense. The Hebrew translation would be better, "When God began creating." So the creation story is seen as ongoing. The Exodus is seen as ongoing. There's only two tenses in biblical Hebrew, perfect and imperfect. It's not like past, present, and future. So there's so much fluidity and flow when you're reading the Bible in Hebrew. But you definitely get the idea of Exodus being ongoing. How has the story been used? We're going to learn a little bit today how the story of Exodus has been used and misused in other contexts. The Puritans, the abolitionists, Mormon civil rights movement using the Exodus story for their own struggles. And of course, applying a psychological, and I know this is what I share in common with Unity and your beautiful New Thought Gathering group, is we apply a psychological or an interpersonal interpretation to the story. And the Baal Shem Tov, one of our great teachers, taught that each of us goes through the Exodus within our own lifetimes. Here's a really cool little example. There's a movie called Prince of Egypt by Disney. If you've got grandchildren, this is a great movie because it really shows Pharaoh and Moses as really close friends and buddies. They were raised together. Moses was a prince of Egypt. He was adopted by the Pharaoh's sister, and he was raised in the courts, and the two were brothers. It's a beautiful allegory of conflict and, God willing, resolution between brothers who are fighting. We sure need that in the world today. The Baal Shem Tov, about 175 years ago, gave us this great teaching that really began the beginning of psychological interpretation of the Torah, of the Bible, into our own personal lives. All 42 journeys of the children of Israel will happen to each individual from the time he or she is born to the time he or she dies. Whatever happened to the people as a whole will happen to each individual. And this refers in the book of Numbers, it speaks about over the 40-year period of time. They were actually not wandering. I don't like that word. They were really journeying. They were trying to figure out how to get into the promised land. And these are the 42 journeys he's referring to, that we all go through these trials, tribulations. The Exodus in history was seen as a template for understanding the Exodus in each of our lives. So here's a lovely illustration of Moses as the sea is parting and the children of Israel are crossing the sea. Forget about it literally, but just understand that sometimes we get into a new situation and we're afraid we're going to drown. And with enough faith and meditation and prayer, a good psychologist and a good lawyer, we might see the waters part so we can get through. Now the Haggadah is the booklet that Jews read in home and synagogue Seder ceremonies each Passover. So the other day we had our first and second day Passover ceremonies in synagogues all over the world. It's a story, song, and ritual guide to help us retell our story of the Exodus from Egypt. It has this mystical element of asking each of us, asking each participant to imagine that each of us today was there in Egypt and in the wilderness as we were freed from slavery. For example, each year at our Seders we read these words: in every generation, people must regard themselves as if they came forth themselves from Egypt. For the Holy One redeemed not only our ancestors, God redeemed us with them. As it is said, God took us out of there to bring us to the land that God promised to our ancestors. So you see that beautiful, what do you call, beyond time sense of this? Even though it's a historical event, we say that God took us, that we were there. This is an example of a Seder. That's my granddaughter on the left over there, as they were preparing for their Seder a few years ago, and a friend of mine leading his family Seder. Judaism very much does its best when it's in the home and not a formal religion in the synagogue. We have beautiful synagogue rituals, but when it's in the home, it's really rich. Why? Because we're singing and we eat. Food is very much a good part of any spiritual tradition.
Rabbi David, let me interject just a minute.
Yeah, please.
We are still seeing your opening slide. There we go. We got another one. Wonderful.
Wow. Let's pause for just 1 second. You didn't see those other slides?
No, we just saw the opener.
Wow.
Now we've got a lovely Seder dinner, I think.
Yeah, well, I had some other lovely slides too that you missed. So let me just go back for 1 second. Are you seeing words there now?
Yep.
Now, continue to share.
The booklet. Uh-huh.
Now, what about this?
The Exodus in history, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you can see that slide?
Yep.
And you see these words?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think we're back on track. I have no idea what happened. Okay.
And there's your granddaughter.
Right. Thanks for letting me know, Susan.
All right.
All right. So preserving Jewish memory. The Seder is so important. Even Jews who are not religious, who are not part of synagogues, the Seder is like a core, not just a springtime holiday, but a springtime where we share our memories of this ancient story of the Exodus. So the Exodus in history was seen as a template to understanding the Exodus in our nations, our communities, and in each of our lives. I want to give you an example of how it's been used. In 1990, the Dalai Lama wanted to know the secret of the Jewish people to have survived in exile for 2,000 years and then were able to return to their ancestral homeland. No other ethnic or religious group had ever done that before. This, by the way, the man on the right is the man who ordained me, Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi. May his memory be a blessing. So Rabbi Zalman knew that the Passover Seder was one of the secrets that helped maintain the Jewish family and hope during our long exile. He wanted to share the infrastructure of the Passover ceremony so that Tibetans could create their own Seder to use in family ceremonies each year, just as we do on Passover. Only they would end their Seder saying, next year in Tibet. We always end our Seder saying, next year in Jerusalem. But the template or the structure of the Seder can really be applied to so many beautiful situations. Black Americans saw themselves fleeing from the South. It is known as the Southern Exodus, where they left the South from 1910, through the 60s, and they used the imagery from the Exodus story in the Bible. On a personal level, the Exodus story can be summed up like this: we get stuck, God frees us, we find out why. So we get stuck is called our exile. The liberation is Passover, and then we count. For example, we're in the middle of counting from the Passover to what we call in Christianity they call it the Pentecost. This is our holiday of Shavuot, the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Now, I happen to have told this to a friend of mine who is an Episcopal priest, and she said, well, this is really interesting because just like you have the enslavement and liberation in the Revelation, it's very parallel to what we celebrate, she was saying. On Good Friday is the crucifixion, Easter Sunday is the redemption, and the Pentecost is the revelation of the Holy Spirit 50 days later. So we were both talking about the parallels. Enslavement in Judaism parallels crucifixion in Christianity. Liberation in Judaism parallels resurrection. Revelation of Torah parallels the descent of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. And again, I know, Susan, for your group, and certainly for me and my synagogue, we don't take this literally as much as we take it as a true metaphor, a true template that can be applied in our lives. We get stuck, we get freed, and we find out why. So, as I was saying before, the word Exodus is not a capital E Exodus in Hebrew. It really is, the word is Yetziah, and it means exit. It's almost as if the story is so natural that all of these words, for example, let's just take this one here. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, and the word of the Holy One from Jerusalem, Ki Mitzion Tetze, going forth. Even the Torah has an exodus. Everything in the world, in nature, has an exodus. It is as if the exodus was not simply an historical event, but a spiritual archetype, expressed over and over and throughout nature and biology. It seems to be a fractal, replicated over and over again by and in each and every one of us, and repeatedly in the natural contractions and expansions throughout our lives. We get stuck, we get free, we find out why. And I just want to repeat that. This idea of a fractal, that the story is an allegory about some historical group 3,300 years ago, but it really is seen in nature. Everything that gets contracted then gets released. It's that contraction and release seem to be part of chemistry and physics and in everything that we see in our lives, including winter and spring. Winter is like the contraction, and springtime is the expansion. There's an exodus going on, or what Christians will call a resurrection. Rabbi Irving Greenberg teaches, the Exodus is not a one-time event, but a norm by which all of life should be judged and guided. The Exodus is an orienting event, an event that sets in motion and guides the Jewish way, and ultimately humanity's way, toward the promised land. The word Egypt actually is not the name of the nation. It is the name of the nation in Hebrew, but it also comes from the word meaning tight, narrow place. And it actually was originally a geographic term. So this is a picture, an aerial picture of the Nile River, and it gets constricted right here, and then it breaks apart into the Delta region, the Nile Delta region, where it bursts forward into the ocean. So in a way, this is a geological concept that became utilized to understand the situation the Jewish people were in slavery, that from the constriction of slavery, they burst forth and became ultimately what became Judaism, right? But it's definitely rooted in nature itself, and is seen everywhere. Everything constricts, contracts, and expands. And by the way, if you have questions, just hold your questions for a moment. We'll have a question and answer session in just a little while. And just another picture. Here's the Nile River. As it goes to the sea, it gets constricted here, and then it bursts open. So it's interesting that a geological feature then becomes the template for understanding this relationship between constriction and expansion, between the people and the liberation from slavery. Now, a lot of people think of the wilderness, they say they wandered in the desert. Well, it really wasn't a desert per se. It was desert-like, or it was high desert. But this is a picture of the Sinai Peninsula, where the Israelites lived for 40 years before they entered the Promised Land. And we have the idea of a desolate, and they were just eating matzah or flatbread for 40 years. God forbid, right? They were always near a little bit of water, the Gulf of Suez and the Red Sea. They always, so they had fish, and they had enough wherewithal to be able to survive in that high desert area. That's just the historical level. But I just wanted to show that to you. Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba. So, and this is the pathway they took to get to Canaan land, the Promised Land. They didn't want to go to war, and there were these tribes that just didn't want. They were kind of anti-immigration tribes, and they were keeping outsiders from coming into the land, and they wouldn't share the land or with anybody from the outside. And with this anti-immigration perspective, the Israelites didn't know where to go, so they skirted around the Sinai Peninsula until they found a way to return to their ancient homeland. It's likely that the Passover story of the Hebrews became associated with two much older festival celebrations, the barley harvest and the lambing season. The angel of death metaphorically skipping over the Hebrew dwellings whose doorposts were painted with the blood of a lamb. As the springtime festival, Pesach, the Hebrew word for Passover, becomes associated with the liberating feelings the season elicits, with a carefree attitude, a skipping over of obstacles. When we leap over an obstacle, the implication is the obstacle is still there. But on a metaphoric journey we make from slavery to freedom, sometimes we don't eliminate our obstacles. We simply skip over them or leap over them. Maybe the idea of a leap of faith comes from this idea. But I show you the lamb because lambs do what's called gambling. They kind of hop and skip. Passover and Easter. In just a moment, I'm going to pause and have questions and answers. In Judaism, the Passover story is a story of liberation told each spring. In Christianity, the story of resurrection is told each spring. And I know in New Thought churches, the whole idea of the Exodus can really be taken as a personal liberation from what happens in all of us. I think I'll skip over this for a moment and let me just stop the share and see what questions folks might have. Let's just take a minute, and I can't quite see everybody because I see myself there, and I'm not sure how to change it to a view of the. Hey, thank you, Kyle.
Rabbi David, could we
Yeah.
are you going to be able to join us for coffee talk after that
Yes.
service?
Yeah.
Well, if we could hold our questions till then, we'll finish our service and then we'll have an extensive period to ask you questions. Would that work?
Sure, absolutely. Good. We'll do that. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Susan. And I'm going to do the meditation very soon as part of the talk. So, just to let you know. I hope I'm not talking too fast, but it's such exciting material for me. But let's just get back on the share. Thanks, Susan. And can you see that picture? Just want to make sure. Susan, can you see that illustration? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, great. All right. All right. Somewhere between enslavement and the promised land is the wilderness, a place of uncertainty, fear, refinement, and opportunity. And on a psychological level, I know some of us are in that place now. We're not sure quite where we are. You know, when I retired after being a pulpit rabbi, congregational rabbi for 35 years, I'm in this kind of wilderness. It's a little uncertain as I'm getting older. I turned 78 last year, and as I get older, there's uncertainty about my future, all our futures. Where are we going? What are we going to do? And we see this spiritually as an opportunity. Even if it's fearful, it's an opportunity. Again, the Baal Shem Tov teaches that all 42 journeys of the children of Israel will happen to each individual from the time he or she is born to the time we die. Whatever happened to the people will happen to each individual. And as another way of looking at the Exodus is that the journey of the Jewish people through the wilderness is an analogy for the journey of the soul from the spiritual realm into our material world. That birth itself is an exodus, you might say, from the womb, from constriction into life itself. Now, here we'll share the interfaith dimension of this, or the interuse of this, not just faith. The American revolutionaries used the story of the Exodus in their quest for independence from the quote-unquote Pharaoh of England, as did the Mormons in search for their own promised land in Utah. Now, the Puritans saw America as the new Canaan, while Quakers considered the restrictive Puritan rules to be a type of Egypt. It's interesting, each of these early Christian denominations were using the Exodus story to prove that their denomination was right, but the other group was wrong. In response, some Puritans, like clergyman Samuel Fisher, compared the Quaker leadership to the councillors of Egypt. Ay, ay, ay. Nothing worse than religious groups fighting with each other, right? For who's right. More than 100 years later, the Exodus saga was used by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. One does not need much imagination to identify the Reverend Martin Luther King as the Moses of his generation. And so he says in this great speech, you could see all the language of the Exodus story in his speech. I think I'm linked to his voice reading these very words. This was his speech that he gave the night before he was assassinated. But you can really hear the Jewish Exodus story in all of his words.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Pretty incredible, isn't that? It gives me chills every time I hear that, because not just of its prophecy, of course, and the tragedy of his assassination, but how he took the story as the Exodus story from the Jewish people 3,300 years ago and applied it to the civil rights movement. And what an irony, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever heard of the slave Bible, but some southern plantations were so scared, they forced the slaves to convert to Christianity, and then they give them a Bible whose main story was the liberation from slavery. So the whole book of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy is how to get free from slavery. So they created this slave Bible, which eliminated the whole book of Exodus and the story of freedom. How crazy, huh? Unbelievable. Enslaved African Americans understood themselves as gods, people struggling against the Pharaoh of American slaveholders. Okay, that's obvious. And then the bottom, white Americans of the Revolutionary era, they used the Exodus story to call for freedom. So this is not even religious, it's more of a secular use, but with a little thought the application to African Americans, despite the latter's concurrent appeal to it. If Puritan Americans had crossed the ocean of the war of independence to find a new Canaan, Africans had been forcibly ripped from their promised land, Africa, and transported to a new Egypt. What an irony, right? They were in the promised land, and they were extracted from their promised land as slaves. And what a striking irony in the way the Exodus story has been used as a liberating for one group, but oppressive to another. When refracted through the experience of liberationist theologians and civil rights leaders, the Exodus functions as a story of freedom, a symbol of freedom. But refracted through the experience of Native Americans, whose identity is not with the conquering Israelites, but with the invaded Canaanites, it becomes a symbol of oppression. In the 16th century, Puritans used the Exodus stories in the settlement of Canaan against Native Americans. Because the biblical focus was on conquering the Promised Land, some New Englanders were able to turn the biblical story against the native inhabitants. What a tragedy. It drives me crazy, and I'm sure you too, when people use their sacred scriptures rather than for a relationship to God and self against some other group. So I'm going to do a meditation in just a moment, but I want to read this first. And it's a poem I wrote about Passover and Easter, and then we're going to do a little visualization. Passover and Easter. Two moon-linked sisters who long ago stopped speaking, yet linked to the fullness of our hearts and the fullness of God's grace. The moon of Sister Miriam desires freedom and the rescue of her people from the cruelty of Pharaoh by the outstretched mighty hand of the Lord. A hand of salvation reaching down from heaven and passing through my nation and down through yours. And then to each of us, each one of us, so may it be. The moon of Mother Mary desires to give her light so that each man and woman may know the power of the resurrection and the soil of death that holds the seeds of rebirth within. A resurrection reaching upward, passing through all nations and up to God Almighty. Two celebrations, two women, Miriam and Mary, who don't even know that they have the same name. One in Hebrew and one in Greek, yet they are both linked to a single full moon. And then each of us begins to count. We count to 50. Beyond the 40 days of Moses on Mount Sinai and Jesus in the wilderness, we go beyond one cycle further to 50, Shavuot and Pentecost. Ours to the revelation of Torah at Sinai, yours to the revelation of the Holy Spirit, freedom and resurrection, revelation and revelation, 12 tribes, 12 disciples, one moon, two traditions, two covenants, one God, Shavuot and Pentecost, two cousins who have just begun to speak. And King David sings to us from his tomb today, teach us to count our days, that we may open our hearts to your wisdom. Some of us, thank God, are listening. So let's take a few moments and we'll do a little meditation. This is a great visualization. It really is what the whole Passover ceremony, the Seder, is all about. But it's a beautiful meditation to do in your own personal life. So as Dennis led us before, let's take a breath, as I'm sure you do, in unity, because breath means spirit. And get yourself comfortable in your chair, eyes open or closed, whatever you'd like. And let's just go on a journey. Imagine yourself 3,000 years ago. You've been a slave. Your family's been a slave for hundreds of years. And you've been freed now. And you're going on a journey in your freedom. But you don't know where you're going. You've never been in that part of the wilderness before. You've heard about this promised land, but you don't know what that means. And so feel the anticipation in your belly, in your chest, in your arms, the excitement and the fear. Don't push away the fear. Welcome the fear. Associate it and connect it to the excitement of the journey that you're on. See yourself in that Sinai Peninsula, in the wilderness. You're not alone. Look around you. There, you see the elders, and there, look at the children and the animals. And you realize, we're in this together. I am not alone. I am not alone. There's a sense of the presence something everybody is calling Shekhinah, the God, the presence of God all around us. Feel that presence. Feel that Holy Spirit all around you. Take a breath. You're in the wilderness. You don't know where you're going. You have the fear, you have the excitement, the anticipation. But you know you're not only not alone with family and friends, but also with the divine presence. Continue walking. Now you have some ground under your feet because you've got this sense of the divine, the mystery. You don't know where you're going, but you're not alone. And you say inside yourself, God, divine mystery, please guide me. Let me not forget that you're with me. Let me not forget that when I feel and see my family all around me, I'm not alone. And so in this visualization, you see yourself in the wilderness. Now open your eyes in the wilderness. What beauty. They call this a desert? No, it's a wilderness. The plants, the soil, the few trees that there are, the sky, the little bit of water. What beauty. What beauty. Now we take a breath. Let's apply this to our own lives. Whoever you are, whoever we are, see yourself in some situation in your life where you've been stuck. Maybe it's about a job or a relationship. Something that's been constricting you. Not exactly slavery, but slavery-like. You've been a slave to responsibilities that were really not always that functional and useful in your life. You've been a slave in a relationship. It's not always been functional. See yourself as liberating yourself right now from that situation. Not alone, with the help of your family and friends. Imagine yourself now, on a personal level, going into a new kind of wilderness. What is your wilderness? Is it leaving an old relationship, an old job? Is it retirement? What is that wilderness that you're uncertain about, but you know you've got to keep going? See yourself going into that wilderness. Imagine now, just like the Israelites did, that you are not alone. Whatever you're doing in your meditation right now, look around inside you and see your family, your friends, your animals, the pets, the ones you love, your ancestors behind you, God within you, and say to yourself, I am not alone. I am being guided. I am not alone. I am being guided. And in your meditation now, take a step and another step. And you keep moving forward and you realize, yeah, there's fear, but there's also joy. There's also joy. That's the story of Passover and Easter. And my dear friends, from this meditation, take a deep clearing breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And look around. I know we're on Zoom, but you know, we're in the promised land. This is the promised land. Zoom, a gathering of friends and people of like minds. This is it. It doesn't get any better, but it keeps replicating itself. And so, my dear friends, it's been such an honor for me to do these teachings for you over the last year, and to be able to be here. I've never had a speaking engagement on Easter Sunday before to a New Thought group. So the final words of meditation is that we're always entering the promised land, wherever we are. We're always in a wilderness, uncertain, but we always have each other. We always have each other.
Thank you, Rabbi David. Lovely, lovely Easter inspiration.
Thanks, Susan.
You know, talking about poetry, my favorite phrase is poetry is the truth of the facts.
Ah,
Have you ever
nice.
run into that?
No, that's beautiful.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
That'll be the end of our recording.